Okay, let's begin talking about interest groups now. Interest groups, by definition, a coalition of people or organization that tries to influence public opinion. So it's a group of people, a collection of people or organizations that come together and attempt to influence public opinion and public policy. By influencing public opinion, they are also trying to influence public policy, specifically to benefit their interest. Theories of interest group formulation. How do interest groups form? The most commonly accepted American philosophy on interest group formation is the pluralist theory, or also called group theory. It basically says that there's only so much stuff that the government can do, only so many resources that the government has. And if you want to compete for those resources and you want to compete for those laws, you have to form a group and compete against other groups. Also, another theory is disturbance theory. Basically, interest groups form by changes in the political system. Changes in the maybe one interest group pops up and they demand something from government. Well, anytime an interest group gets something from government, they're making a demand and taking something from somebody else. If somebody wants, if an interest group rises up and wants more tax dollars raised to spend on schools, well, those tax dollars come from somebody else. They come from lots of people. So they are taking tax dollars from those people for their interests. So another group may pop up against taxes. So there may be another group that says, well, we want to lower taxes because we don't like that group over there trying to raise taxes. So when this interest group pops up that says we want to lower taxes, and if they succeed, well, they're taking something from somebody else as well. They're taking tax dollars that go to support some other program, either be it education or military or whatever. If you lower taxes, that means there's less money for that. So you are whatever, almost all the time, whatever demand an interest group makes on government, they're taking something from somebody else. If somebody demands lower speed limits, we want to lower all the speed limits by 10 miles per hour, well, you're taking away somebody's freedom to go as fast as they want, or going faster. There's also transactions theory that basically all interest groups are exchanges between existing political actors within the political parties. That there's really that the public really doesn't have a lot of say. That it's only the leaders of the interest groups that really matter, that make the decisions. And then population ecology theory. It just based on the idea that there's only so many resources that will be allocated to any different issue, and you must have a certain population or a certain strength in your interest group to increase the resources that you might get. So it's about the population and how the world works, the ecology of the interest group environment. Now, there are different kinds of interest groups. There are public interest groups. These interest groups seek the collective good. They're generally there's really rarely any economic benefit or other tangible benefit to belonging to and supporting this group. These are often like good government groups, those that look out for corruption in government. They're watching what our government officials and even businesses as well do, and they expose them when they're doing corrupt things. Uh, some environmental interest groups are considered public interest groups that seek the collective good, because if you're an environmental interest group that's supporting cleaner air policies, cleaner water policies, then that benefits everybody. That benefits the entire public. That's the collective good. Then there are also economic interest groups. These are interest groups that are just created for the specific purpose of increasing the financial interests of its members, promoting the financial interests of its members, to make the members more money, to improve their opportunities in the economy. Things like you know let's say the American Automobile Dealers Association. American Automobile Dealers Association is an economic interest group that promotes the interests of automobile dealers and tries to get government to implement policies that make it uh, more likely for them to be successful. Then there's governmental interest groups or governmental units. These are just basically cities and states that that form interest groups to compete for money from the federal government. Um, there's only so much money that the federal government doles out. It seems like that it's unlimited, but there is a limit to how much money the federal government spends, and so you have to compete. As if you're a local or state government, you have to compete with other state and local governments and other interest groups for those funds. And then there's political action committees. This is a very specific kind of interest group. It's an officially registered fundraising organization that represents the interest groups in the political process. So you might have an interest group like the American Automobile Dealers Association, who has lobbyists and they have people that go to Washington to try to promote their interests. But they also have a political action committee whose sole purpose is to raise money to influence elections. Every single major interest group has a political action committee, which its sole purpose is to raise money and use that money to influence elections and to get people elected that will support that interest group's interests in government. Now let's take a look at the development of American interest groups. Uh, James Madison and the founders. As I mentioned before, the founders, when we talked about parties, they didn't like political parties, and they hoped against hope that political parties would not form. But inevitably they will, because there will always be factions within societies. And these factions will always think that their way is the best way. These factions will always do what they can to promote their own interests and to try to influence government to pass policies that benefit them. That's just human nature. You're going to try to do what's best for yourself and those with similar interests. So they recognized that the founders did that these factions could play a very important and sometimes negative role in the political process. So they, with the establishment of the Constitution, they implemented certain things into the Constitution with the hopes of limiting the powers of factions or interest groups in becoming much. They were trying to keep the interest groups becoming too influential in government. So a single interest group couldn't just take over and run the country for their own benefit. And the systems they put into place were three of them actually. Federalism, which divides power between the national and the state governments. Both are sovereign, and we learned about this earlier in the semester. And by doing this, you spread power out. If the states can check the federal government and the federal government can check the states, then there is it's hopefully less likely that either one or the other can become tyrannically powerful. Of course, today the federal government is much more powerful than the states, but back then it was the power was more equal. Separation of powers, the idea that one person or group of people cannot be in both either the executive and the legislative branch, or the executive and the judicial, or the judicial and the legislative. You have powers that are separated. Also, within the powers, separation of powers, each branch of government has a different role. Congress makes the laws, the executive and the president execute the laws or carry out the laws, and of course the judicial branch defines what the law means and adjudicates the laws. The same person cannot, or the same group of people cannot make the law and carry out the law. The same group of people can't carry out the law and decide who's guilty or innocent or adjudicate the law. You separate those powers, and that prevents one small group of people from controlling all the levers. And then you have checks and balances. Those are those checks that each branch has on the other, um, such as the president has a veto power over Congress. The president, if he feels like Congress has gone too far or passed a law that is against the interests of the American people, the president can veto it. If there's enough support, and that's a check on the Congress, but if there's enough support in Congress that they think the president is not vetoing in the best interest of the country, if they get a two-thirds vote in Congress, they can override the president's veto. So that's a way in which Congress and the president check each other. Also, in the judiciary, the courts have the power the federal courts have the power, specifically the Supreme Court, to impeach the president. So that's a check on the president. They can remove the president from office. Congress is part of that too. Congress is part of that impeachment process. Actually, Congress does the impeachment process, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over it. Um, uh, the judiciary can declare acts of Congress and the president unconstitutional. That's another check. And of course, the president picks people in the Supreme Court who will sit on the courts, and the Senate must approve it. So that's a check for the president and Congress on the courts. So as you can see, each branch checks the other. Uh, Starting in 1830, national groups begin to emerge. Prior to 1930, I mean, sorry about that. Prior to 1830, most interest groups in the nation were local, or maybe regional, but generally local. And that was mainly because of communication. I mean, you might have a group come together to try to solve a problem in Boston, but nobody else. They didn't have uh, telephones or emails or television or anything like that for people in New York or Charleston, South Carolina, to know what Boston is doing. So these groups stayed relatively local. But when you see the advent of the uh, Morse code and the telegraph, people began to, and the more national expansion of newspapers, you see people, these interest groups begin to become broader and have more broad-based support. Um, so early on, single issue groups developed nationally. Temperance, the prohibition movement, abolitionism, the anti-slavery movement, the Grange, which was a pro-farmers movement, and then corporations, of course, have their own interest groups and their own interests. And it's during this time when interest groups become national, that lobbyists, or these people that uh, are hired by the different interest groups to argue their point of view to and influence Congress into the system. So lobbyists begin to when national parties emerge, lobbyists begin to infiltrate the system and become very important players within the interest group system. Then you have the Progressive Era and the New Deal, 1890 to 1950s. We've already talked a little bit about the Progressive Era. Basically, the Progressive Era was an era of rapid industrialization, immigration, and monopolistic business practices. And what the Progressive Era and the New Deal does, it's a reaction to that. Okay, they're saying, look at all of these problems that are being caused by industrialization, immigration, monopolistic business practices. What can we do about it? And those were the Progressive New Deal policies. And basically, they consist of organized labor. How do we challenge monopolistic business practices? How do we challenge poor working conditions, low wages, child labor? Well, organized labor. Collectively bargain for higher wages and better working conditions. Business groups and trade associations, of course, then form to counter the power of the organized labor groups and these other groups. So that's disturbance theory. One group pops up, another one will pop up. So business groups and trade associations become more powerful. And because of all the problems involved with um, monopolistic business practices and illegal and unethical business practices, the Federal Trade Commission is formed. And it's to investigate one of the charges of the Federal Trade Commission is to investigate the lobbying tactics of interest groups, how the lobbyists are influencing government policy, because it was not uncommon for lobbyists just to go and bribe members of Congress, just to walk around Capitol Hill where Congress meets and hand out bags of money saying, basically, vote for the bill that we support and give them $1,000 or whatever. So, these things had to be investigated and hopefully limited, and that was the purpose of the Federal Trade Commission, or one of the purposes of the Federal Trade Commission. Then in the 1960s and the 1970s, you see the rise of what we'll call the interest group state. Um, Interest groups surge, especially what we'll call identity interest groups, groups that form to promote the interests of a certain group of people, demographic group of people. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, formed to challenge and fight the segregationist laws, especially in the South. Uh, you know, uh, the NAACP was the driving force behind of course, the earlier um, segregated schools, but of course, segregation, economic segregation, economic discrimination still occurred in different parts of society, and so the NAACP becomes even more powerful and more influential. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, fighting for and arguing for the protections of our civil liberties, First Amendment rights. Anti-war groups, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, basically the Latino version of the NAACP. Then you see women's rights groups like NOW, National Organization of Women, AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. And then you have gay rights groups. So you have the surge of these groups coming to the fore, uh, arguing for rights for their members, rights for these people. And of course, anytime you have this, as I mentioned before in disturbance theory, anytime you have the rise of interest groups, you will have a backlash. And you get a conservative backlash from basically white Christians fundamentalist types, Christians who challenge this upsetting of the existing order. And challenge the traditional values that they see as important. And the conservative response during the 70s and into the 80s was something called the Moral Majority, which was led by a guy named Jerry Falwell, and another group called the Christian Coalition, which, and both of these groups attempted to rally people to vote based on their religious beliefs. Then you have business groups, corporations, and associations, the Business Roundtable. Most large corporations have their own interest groups. And then organized labor. Organized labor, as we saw earlier, really became important in the progressive era, and it really peaked in the 1940s and 1950s. But recently, it has seen a precipitous decline. There was an overt effort by the government, especially with the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan, to destroy unions or at least to cripple them to such a way where they uh, had very, very little influence. Uh, the AFL-CIO and the SEIU, American Federation of Labor, the Convention of Industrial Organizations, or I think that's what that says, and the uh, Service Employee Union is the SEIU. These are still unions that exist, but not very much influence these days. Okay, now what do interest groups do? Mainly they lobby. Lobbying is the key component in any interest group. Uh, they are organization activities that seek to influence political leaders. If your interest group does anything to try to persuade members of Congress or try to persuade members of government to act on your behalf, you are lobbying them. You are acting as a lobbyist. Uh, Congress is generally targeted first. If you're a lobbyist, you want to hit Congress first because they're the ones that write the laws. If you can catch Congress and influence Congress and lobby Congress before or as the laws are being written, well, then that's the best place to be. Then the laws can be written to benefit you. Uh, Now, one of the problems with this is that many of these large corporations um, that attempt to lobby members of Congress and especially committees in Congress. Well, members of those committees, you know, if they work on behalf of those corporations, if members of Congress do things and pass laws to benefit these lobbyists and these corporations, well, after they leave Congress, these congressmen can go work for um, these corporations, and these corporations are going to hire them to thank them really for their work in helping them get laws passed. So you end up seeing a revolving door from congressional work to lobbying. And a lot of these ex-members of Congress will turn around and lobby the very people in the very committees that they used to work in because they have access. They know these people's home phone numbers. They play golf with them. And so these corporations find a lot of value in that. Wouldn't you, if you were a large corporation or a large interest group, want to hire lobbyists that already knew the members of the committees that actually wrote the laws that influenced you? That would be perfect. So you see this revolving door from congressional work to lobbying for um, interest groups. Now, once the law is passed, though, that's not the end. Once the law is passed, you can lobby the executive branch because the executive branch is the one that actually carries out the law. Uh, if Congress passes a tax law that says, okay, we're going to change the tax rate to this, well, Congress doesn't enforce that law. The IRS, which is part of the executive branch and works for the president, enforces that law. So you want to lobby the executive branch to make sure that the policy is being enforced in a way that best benefits your interest group. You can also influence the courts. You can also lobby the courts, and that is generally done through something called amicus curiae briefs. Amicus curiae is a Latin term for friend of the court. Friend of the court briefs, amicus curiae. Basically, it's just a legal document or a brief that you send if there's a court case before the Supreme Court or the federal courts that impacts your interest group. You would write them a legal brief saying this is why you should vote or you should rule in this way in favor of our interest group because these are the legal reasons. And so that's all an amicus curiae brief is. It's a friend of the court brief that attempts to influence the decisions of the judiciary. Also, interest groups can do grassroots work, basically rallying their individual members to put pressure on politicians through phone calls, through emails, faxes, whatever. You can rally up the rank and file to contact members of Congress or contact their politicians, and then the last resort usually for interest groups is protest and radical activism. And we talked about this earlier. There's a long history in the United States of this, but it's a risky proposition. But if you feel like that you have a legitimate problem or legitimate purpose, and your group is not being adequately represented and adequately attended to in the existing governmental system, well, you might want to protest. You might want to march. You might want to boycott. And this is just a little chart that shows interest group tactics and what percentage of interest groups actually use these tactics. Of course, testifying at hearings. This is the most common one. That's number one, and that's the one you should probably know because every law comes out of a committee, and every committee, when they're debating whether to pass a law or move a law onto the floor of the House or the Senate for a vote, they want to hear from those that will be impacted by the law, and those are called hearings, committee hearings. And this is where the lobbyists can come in and speak at these hearings to promote the interests of their interest group. All right, let's talk about election activities of interest groups. Uh, they do quite a few different things. They recruit candidates and they endorse candidates. As far as recruiting candidates and finding candidates that support their point of view or their policies, they may actually find existing candidates and train them in ways to speak about their policies or their issues. Or, of course, like most interest groups do, they offer financial assistance to candidates because winning elections historically has been about, you know, all about the money and who has the most money. Also, some of the activities they do would be like getting out the vote programs, uh, actually finding people in the that support your policies, your interest group's goals, and persuading them and encouraging them to get out and vote. Uh, Staying in constant contact with them, reminding them that the elections are coming up, and then sometimes helping them get to the polls. They can rate candidates or office holders. There are a lot of websites out there run by interest groups who rate the different members of Congress or the different candidates based on how often they vote for policies that benefit that interest group. And so they would have 100%. You know, if every vote went that dealt with, say, an environmental issue, then an environmental interest group might give a congressperson 100% rating. If they never voted in favor of environmental regulations, they would give them a 0 rating. So there's many websites out there that do that. Also, providing campaign contributions. Talked about that just a while ago. Most all major interest groups have something called political action committees, PACs, And these are just fundraising arms of the interest group. And as we know, money is the most important component of success uh, in elections for the most part. There are exceptions where people with less money win elections, but it's rare. And then interest groups can even run their own ads. It's called direct advocacy. They will just create their own ads, pay for their own ads in support of a candidate or a policy or an issue. Uh, because of recent Supreme Court decisions, including Citizens United, uh, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, uh, these interest groups and these political action committees can spend as much money as they want. So, a huge corporation like Walmart or Exxon or Microsoft can basically spend millions, if not billions, of dollars if they want to get a person elected. And and in my mind, that unfairly skewers the democratic process in favor of wealthy people, wealthy corporations, and wealthy groups, interest groups. So in the end, what makes interest groups successful? There are interest groups that do a very good job at persuading policymakers and the public to support their cause. Others not so successful. Well, probably the most important. Well, there's the two most important are leadership and funding. Leadership includes you have to have somebody, people at the top, who can recruit members, who can organize the resources that the interest group have, including money and people. Uh, a good leader would be able to raise money for the interest group. And maybe most important for leadership in an interest group is having access to policymakers. That's why that revolving door that I talked about in class is important. If you already know the people on the congressional committees making the policy, it makes it much more likely that you will have access to them. They will listen to you. They trust you. They know you. So leadership must have access to the policymakers. And you can have all the recruiting, organizing, and fundraising you want, but if you can't talk to the people making the policy, you probably won't have a lot of success. Funding and patrons, money, people to give you money. Money is required for advertising, litigating. That means suing, going through the court systems in order to defend your cause or promote your cause. And of course, you have to pay money to lobbyists to promote your interest group in government. So money is vitally important, and also, I mentioned running ads, and then of course members. Members are broken down between leaders and workers, rank and file. Leaders, there's relatively few, just like in any organization. You have a few leaders that organize and recruit, fundraise. Then you have the workers, members of the interest group. They attend meetings, pay dues, and volunteer their time and actually do things for the interest group. So these are the workers of the interest group. And but the most common member of an interest group would be just what we call rank and file. They may pay dues, and they may uh, donate money, but they don't really do anything. They don't attend meetings. They don't actually go out and door to door for fundraising or get out the vote or anything like that. Generally, they are just members in name only, and that's the majority of most members of an interest group. Members of interest groups, those that involve themselves in interest groups, tend to be wealthier than the average person, and they tend to be more educated than the average person. And what happens is, oftentimes, these wealthier, more educated people, not only are they a member of one interest group, they're a member of multiple interest groups. So their influence and their money overlaps different interest groups. So they tend to be much more involved in the political process. Of course, we talked about in class, the wealthier and the more educated also vote more. So it makes sense that they're more likely to be involved in an interest group. Now, all interest groups have one major problem, and that is called the free rider problem. And the free rider problem basically is this problem of people who benefit from the interest group's work, who reap benefit from higher wages or cleaner water or or lower taxes that the interest groups have worked for, but yet they're not part of the interest group. They don't pay dues. They don't do anything to help. They're a free rider. They get all the benefits of the interest group, yet they don't do anything. But and a lot of times, if people know that they're going to benefit, they will choose not to. If they're going to know they're going to benefit without involving themselves, they're going to choose not to involve themselves. So this has always been a problem with interest groups. This problem of free riders. Political scientists have kind of organized the relationship between interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy, which is really kind of the executive branch, the bureaucracy, the people that carry out the laws. And there's a very, very consistent relationship between the three, the interest groups, Congress, and in the bottom corner of that, it looks like the CONG part of Congress has been cut off, but that should say Congress, and the bureaucracy. Uh, Interest groups provide Congress with electoral support. They run ads for them. They donate money to their campaigns. And in return, you see the arrow going up from Congress up to interest groups. They get friendly legislation, friendly oversight, because you don't want to anger the interest groups that are giving you money. Now, the interest groups also lobby the bureaucracy or the executive branch, so the policies will be put in place in such a way that it benefits them. Also, the interest groups will try to encourage the bureaucracy to ask for more money for the causes that the interest group is interested in, and so the bureaucracy is benefiting from the interest groups, and in return, the bureaucracy gives the interest groups low regulation on whatever industry it is, or favorable regulation on whatever industry is that the interest group involves itself in. Now, Congress also funds the bureaucracy. Remember, the Congress is the power of the purse. They fund the bureaucracy. So that arrow going funding and political support to the bureaucracies exist only because Congress pays for them, and in return, the bureaucracy implements the policy in such a way that Congress would like, which usually benefits the interest groups. So all these working parts, it's kind of that, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of arrangement between the three parts of the iron triangle. For testing purposes, just kind of know that the iron triangle consists of the interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy, and they all do things to benefit each other. These lobbyists that work for the interest groups, their job is to persuade legislators to pass laws that benefit them. The potential is always there for corruption and illegality, such as bribery. I mean, historically, back in the early days of lobbying, back in the beginning of the huge railroad companies, railroad lobbyists would just walk around Congress handing out bags of money to the legislators, just blatant bribes. So over time, the government decided it was probably a good idea to regulate the lobbyists, to have some oversight over these people that are influencing Congress and influencing the laws. So in 1946, Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act required registration and quarterly financial reports of lobbyists. Okay, who are the lobbyists? If you're going to lobby in Congress, you have to register, and you have to report any money that's spent in the process of lobbying. And that was the main law. Oftentimes it was weekly regulated and weekly enforced. 1995, the Lobbying Disclosure Act required registration of all lobbyists with the House or Senate clerk, whichever branch of whichever house of the Congress you were lobbying. 2, you had to report clients and issues and agency lobbied. So if you were a lobbyist and you were lobbying anybody, either Congress or the executive branch, you had to report who you were lobbying, what issues you were talking about, and which agencies were involved in this. And then, of course, you had to estimate your pay. You had to report how much money you were receiving from the interest group that you were lobbying on behalf of. And then in 2007, a new law was passed, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, and basically placed limits on the revolving door time limits, where I think it's 2 years. You cannot go directly from Congress to lobbying. You have to wait 2 years by law. It's to prevent that revolving door, but it's still, I don't believe it's enough. Should be, I personally believe that a member of Congress should be banned from lobbying, at least lobbying for the industry in which they made laws and they were a member of the committee. Ban on gifts and more disclosure. Executive branch lobbyists, they have pretty much the same limitations and same standards for regulation as congressional lobbyists.